Excellent, everybody. So, welcome to this webinar about fixing SharePoint. I think the thing which drove this to me is a lot of people have moved to SharePoint and they're not getting what they want out of it. Maybe some levels of confusion with information all over the place, or just think they've seen things on the internet, think, well, how do I get to that? That looks amazing. So I thought no better person to bring into this session today than Ben. Ben, you've been a SharePoint architect for a long time. You've seen a lot of Microsoft 365. So thank you for joining us today. What are we going to cover today? And really, who's this for? Who should be tuning in?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rupert. So really, this is for anyone who is perhaps a business leader. Maybe you're an IT manager or director, or perhaps you're a team lead within a larger organization. But ultimately, you'll have the same sort of common challenges, which is that you're frustrated with SharePoint. It feels chaotic, inconsistent. And ultimately, it's lost the trust of your people. People aren't using it as effectively as they could do. In terms of takeaways, we're going to look at three key things. So first, some signs that perhaps you are having some issues with SharePoint yourself, some of the common symptoms that we see. We're going to look at how we can create consistency through things like standard templates, etc., so that you can make a more scalable and repeatable ways of working so people feel more confident when they're using SharePoint. And then we can look at see how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. How are we going to approach getting that future ready set up, and how you're going to transition to it.
Perfect. Okay, well, let's dive into that first part straight away without further ado. I guess we need to understand, firstly, have I got a problem? That's, I guess, half the piece. The other half is what's the opportunity, not only to fix maybe what I have, but what else can I do with SharePoint? And then I talked about goals, which is really, SharePoint looks good if I can answer yes to these questions. So let's start with symptoms and see, what people are talking about and why maybe why you've tuned in today. So I think the first thing I see speaking to clients is, look, my people, they can't find what they're looking for. And what does that mean? It means that there's multiple versions of documents which maybe look similar. There's multiple teams and sites with overlapping purposes. And either that means that we're recreating data, or we're having to interrupt somebody who's maybe the owner of that piece of data, of that document, and distract them from that piece of work. It might also mean that they've gone on holiday for a week and I got to come back to them, 7 days down the line. So Ben, what's driving that? What's behind that? Why have we got into this mess?
So ultimately, the root cause here is that there's no consistent or clear structure. People are filing stuff inconsistently because they don't know where or how they should be filing. There's not any or appropriate use of metadata, so you're not benefiting from some of the key things that SharePoint provides. And as you say, all of this is leading to wasted time, frustration, interruptions, etc.
Okay. So yeah, that's number one. Number two is the flip side of, when I can't find stuff is like where I don't know where to save stuff, or maybe where I don't know where to start stuff. So what do? I revert to my desktop, and then you see plenty of desktops with hundreds of files across it. And if it's not desktops, maybe everything's sitting in the person's OneDrive. Obviously, challenges around that is that my team can't find these files. If I leave the organization, someone might have to trawl through my OneDrive to find out, what's there. Is that useful? Is that still current? Why are people reverting to desktops when they've got this beautiful shared environment in Teams and SharePoint?
Yeah, so again, it kind of boils down to sort of uncertainty. People don't know where they should be saving, and so they take the shortcuts. They just need to get on and do what they need to do, so they're going to go and save it on their desktop or their OneDrive. Maybe they're worried about who's got access. They're worried about sort of data security. How, can they be sure that only the right people have got access to something? So what they end up doing is saving it somewhere where they have more control. But ultimately, this is going to lead to, the team not having access to what it needs, that risk if someone leaves, etc.
Okay. Yeah, I think that security thing is a really important part of it. The safest place is my desktop. I know only I can see it. When I'm into, SharePoint sites, particularly if I may be working on sort of repetitive type of things like projects or, some kind of engagement, each project is different, even though Teams, maybe starts out the same way. But when I get into a project, structure's different, maybe a different project manager or has set projects up. And I spend more time trying to find where the files should go and learning about the site than actually working on my content. That usability thing, really struggle with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things here, isn't there? So I think the first is that knows that standard templates have been put in place. SharePoint doesn't make it the easiest to create your own templates out of the box. So having to put something in place to make that a bit easier, whether it's a project template, for instance. But the other thing is, I'm going to call this out a bit, which is I think when you look at the Microsoft marketing, they do focus a lot on making beautiful looking SharePoint sites where you can really, almost showcase your individual creativity. But I think the challenge is in an intranet or a SharePoint working environment, it's not really about that. It's about trying to have a consistent user experience. Ultimately, this is a tool. So we need to make it feel familiar, so people don't need to relearn when they go to each site how to get the information that they need. So this leads to poor usability, having to relearn every site, and just not a great user experience at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think, if you look at maybe the big news site like the BBC, it's a consistent layout, whether in the business section, the politics section, any other section, and you can focus on the content. I guess that's what we're trying to achieve here. Now, this is interesting. Obviously, with COVID, a lot of people turned on Teams very quickly, and suddenly they found that, well, everybody could create Teams, and they did, and they ended up with hundreds of Teams with few or no files each in. Or the other thing that I see is you get Teams where the names are very similar, and it's like mixed purposes. Like somebody might have created, marketing content, somebody else might have created marketing material, somebody else might have created advertising materials. And we've got into this mess of everything's kind of trying to achieve the same goal, but we're hitting it from 100 different approaches.
Yeah, so I mean, again, this is really as a result of not having any real governance about how teams can be created. So the default experience is that anyone can create a team, and they really do. And you end up with, whether it's duplication, inconsistent use, overlapping teams. And from the end user experience, that's quite overwhelming, because you're added into so many different teams. The teams interface is cluttered, and you'll find that data is copied around in multiple places, and is not particularly easy to use. So yeah, the key thing is there's no real governance applied to how and when and who can create a team.
Yeah, I think it's that bit about if a bit more thought went in at the beginning, then maybe we get a better outcome. Coming on to the last point here, Ben, which is I find, and I speak to clients where they've had all their files, folders, they're in maybe one document library, a couple of document libraries, and we're not, we're talking thousands and thousands of files here, up to a terabyte of data. It's causing massive issues if I'm trying to use OneDrive. I can't archive stuff because it's all in one site. I'm worried about security. How did I get into that pickle?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think probably the worst experience of this I've seen is a customer that had, I think, in the region of 2 million files in one library, and something like four terabytes of data. And generally this happens as a result of a, maybe this person would have done this with the best intentions, but someone that perhaps isn't that experienced with SharePoint, treating it like a file share and then approaching the migration in that way. It's very technical led, and they migrate their entire file share into SharePoint, and then go and start applying complicated permission structures to it in the same way they would have done in their file share. Now, the problem is SharePoint is not a file share. It doesn't work in the same way. And when you end up doing something like syncing that library with OneDrive, it's going to cause lots of performance issues on your laptops, which are then going to go through to IT saying that their laptop isn't working in the most optimum way.
Got you. Okay, so if I'm seeing these things, then you're in the right webinar, even if just one of these things. Let's go on to the next one. And in this slide, what's the opportunity? We talked about the pain. If we flip it to what's the opportunity? If I do this, go through this process, where am I going to be by the end of this, Ben? And I've noticed someone's got a little Copilot license, little icon in there. So that's obviously got to be a play. And that's one of the things actually which is raising a lot of interest, is how do I get Copilot ready? So you want to dive into that a little bit, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, the first thing really is we can look at reducing that friction. So, automating how templates are spun up so that things are looking consistent, everything is standardized, people feel confident when they go one place to another, that it feels familiar and that they know what it is that they need to do. The next thing is about making compliance more straightforward. So when we have these sites and we are, taking a simplified approach to our permissions, which is where we're aiming to apply permissions at the site level, it makes it much clearer where the ownership is and ensuring we've got more easy visibility around, around access. We can then start leading with purpose. So we're looking at we're going to introduce or reintroduce these concept of publishing, collaborate, and filing, and making sure that we're using the right tools for the right context. So it's clear, demarked areas for publishing content that everyone can access versus more secure, collaborative, or filing areas. And then we're going to look at ensuring that our SharePoint structure is designed for how our business operates and not purely just simply creating spaces aligned to our departments. So if we take an example of that, something like payroll, payroll may actually sit between multiple departments with only subsets of people in each department, and therefore it makes more sense to create a space dedicated to that around that particular process. If we look at the value chain side of things, i.e., the work that an organization does for its external stakeholders, that might vary based on, that you're a services organization, or you're an R&D organization, and you might create structures to represent those different processes instead of purely thinking on a department by department basis.
Excellent. So that's we talked about the pay and the opportunity. So I've got my little health checklist, Ben, and if I can say yes to these three things on the next slide, that's going to tell me actually we've done all right here. So the first thing is, as a person, I know that if I point to a piece of content and I'm looking, maybe it's the company handbook, I'm confident that that is the current version. I can make a decision on that, maybe book my holiday based on those rules, that kind of thing. So I trust that. I don't need to go and speak to a person to validate that. So that's number one. And that's actually also a big play for if you're looking at Copilot agents, that you want to point it to that data and say, you can index this data as an agent because it is all being reviewed, approved, trusted, and it's a good baseline. I think the second thing is it's the saving and the finding. So I'm confident where to save it. I'm also confident where to find it again, whether I've saved it or whether somebody else has. So I've got the confidence to work independently without having to lean on somebody every time I create a new file or try and find something. And then the security point is I'm confident that when I save something, I know that only the right people can have access. I'm saving an employee contract. I'm confident that only HR people can see that. No one else is going to see it who shouldn't be seeing it. So we've got that structure set up. And this enables people to work, independently. Obviously, you're still going to collaborate, but the technology and yourself working much more in sync. So that's the goal. Then let's think about, Ben, well, what do we need to consider if we're going to start creating our new world? What are the principles here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing is to look at those content scenarios again. So as I said, we're kind of revisiting this from a previous webinar we've done, but to sort of reintroduce it. The first is thinking about publishing. So when we think about publishing, it's generally a small group of people in an organization that are making information available for a large group right now. So it's relevant right now, it's up to date, it's current, and it's that small group publishing to a large group of consumers, such as an intranet, which might even be the whole of the organization. It's different types of content, so it's web pages, video, documents. And from a governance perspective, we're thinking about ensuring it's kept up to date. So has it got a review life cycle? Is it fresh? Is it current? Has it got an appropriate owner? And is there some form of internal approval process to ensure that it gets published onto the intranet? So the next scenario is filing. So when we think about filing, it's and there's obviously quite a lot of overlaps here, but generally I would say that filing is for a smaller group of people that are saving things to be used at a later date in time. So when you're filing it, it's not necessarily about because I need to access it now, it's because I need to keep it for a period of time. I have an obligation to keep it. It's compliance stuff, it's contracts, it's legal stuff, So I need to organize it so that I can find it at a later date if I need it. It's generally going to be more things like, documents, PDFs, those types of things, as opposed to perhaps rich media content. And when we're thinking about governance here, there's obviously things around permissions, but we're also thinking about how long do we need to keep this stuff? How can I ensure I'm keeping it for the 7 years that's required, and actually not keeping it any longer than I need to by disposing of it afterwards?
Got you.
And then finally, we've got collaboration, which is, I think, sometimes what we're kind of often thinking about all the time. It's that, what am I working on right now? Am I drafting something? Am I working on a presentation? Am I working in a project? Maybe there's a process that me and my team work together day to day. So it's generally around those teams, whether it's project, functional teams, etc. The type of content could be very variable. It could be preparing stuff for an intranet, so it could be media content, it could be documents, it could be anything. And when we're thinking about governance, we're probably more focusing purely around permissions, including, are there things like external stakeholders that we need to share with as well?
Got you. That really helps. Look, if you want to find out more about this, we've got another webinar on this. The link will actually be on the screen, so you can click on that. But it's all about how do you structure SharePoint.
So, Rupert, do you want to talk us through some examples of each of those, I think?
Yeah, I think the classic published example, which you touched on yourself, is the intranet. So the intranet is effectively, your news source, but it doesn't have to be news. It can be that policy which has gone through a review process. We have a solution called Policy Express, which does just this, does that review process, and then publishes it as a PDF in our scenario. So it's that trusted information. You might also see knowledge bases like this. So we certainly see knowledge in some scenarios where it goes through a review process and it goes through some curation. Others may be a bit more collaborative. It depends on the organization. But it's information that you can work off and which is generally open to everybody. If we consider filing examples, there's a few classics here. Contracts, and there might be employee contracts. They could be contracts of other companies that you're working with. These are the kind of documents where you're probably going to put some metadata because you want to search for these quickly, whether it's the person's name, whether it's their joining date. You might want to say, well, everyone who joined last year, I need to have a look at that. Maybe they get some benefit after being a year. Or it might be financial statements that you want to record. So that's defining stuff. You're not going to be changing this content. You may also protect it, as Ben said. So you might want to say, well, we need to keep that for 6 years or something along those lines. And then obviously collaboration. Think about the documents where you might invite somebody into that document, whether that's a tracker, maybe it's a project file. It might also be that, I think Ben touched on this, is that a file may start in collaboration and end up in filing or publishing. You might start with a policy that we work on as a document, maybe with your HR advisor and your, head of quality or somebody like that. And when it's complete, it's going to be published. So, just because a document starts in one of these swim lanes, it doesn't mean it finishes there. There are obviously cases where that is the case, but it is worth thinking about that. Okay, Ben. So where does that take us next?
So, yeah, I mean, I think that probably the next point to be thinking about is how do we start organizing this into a sort of tangible set of SharePoint structures. And as you can see, the key thing is this concept of SharePoint hubs. And what we've done is look at breaking those different sites down based on their scenarios and look at organizing them into the different hubs. So we'd be looking at having an intranet hub, for instance, with those various different sites for publishing that we were talking about earlier. So very much a publishing focused hub. And then we've got our support functions, for those functions that are supporting the operation of the business. And then looking at our value chain where we've got that delivery hub, which could be organized by projects, for instance. And then the key benefit of these being organized in hubs in that way is they're going to get that consistent navigation, they're going to get a consistent and relevant search experience, and we can sort of manage the permissions in the appropriate way within those sites, and they all sort of form part of that hub.
Perfect. Let's bring that to life, Ben. There we go. So I'm in my intranet here, Ben. Do you want to guide me around and just show me some of those principles around the hubs you talked about? So we talked about the intranet hub, which I think is where I've started.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if we look at our intranet, first of all, so as we said, this is very much that publishing scenario. It's kind of what you would expect to see from an intranet. We've got news being published to us. We've got our links and various different things. It's part of that wider hub itself. So it has that consistent navigation if you hover over that. And you can see we've got navigation to various different areas such as, published people information, IT information, facilities, etc. But if we start thinking about some of this consistency that we're talking about, it's really looking at how we started to create standard templates for each of these areas. So perhaps if you go to the IT site a minute.
Sure.
So we can see here we have I was going to say hit refresh. So we have here, we've got a sensible, organized layout with news stories at the top. We've got key links that we need to get to. We've got a link to contact IT if we need any further information. And then we've got those sort of key call to actions for things such as, approved software. And then we're starting to embed in things like questions through Viva Engage, for example. So it's a very structured, organized way that's presenting information to me in a clear and laid out way. So perhaps if we go to our facilities site, which is the next one.
Okay.
And again, we can see it's following the same pattern. So the content's different, but the layout is just the same. So when I go from one place to another, I know what it is that I'm looking for. I don't have to relearn the way that the site is working. I can get what I need. I know how to contact. It's consistent. It feels like it's been well thought through and sort of put together.
Yeah, I think what I like about this, Ben, is if I've got a question I want to share with the community, I know I can click on that page, scroll down, and there it is. There's the Q&A, and I can ask a question here using, in this case, as you say, Viva Engage. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. So let's maybe have a look at maybe one of the more collaboration scenarios a minute. So Rupert, if you want to jump over to our projects hub, so this is a sort of demo for a professional services organization. So we can see within our projects hub, again, we've created a dedicated space to manage our projects. We've got sort of standard published information. Perhaps you have a bid library of reusable content that you're working on when you have to tender for projects. And then we can see a list of all of the active projects that we're working on right now. So they'll have a project code, and we're able to assign status to them to represent the full life cycle. Or if you click into the link itself, Rupert, for that first project there, we'll see the actual underlying workspace for that project. So again, what we've got is a well thought through standard project site layout. We have configured this over and above what you get from Microsoft out of the box because we've made this far more relevant and useful. So one of the key things that we've done is introduce a working area, which is that collaboration that we're talking about. We've got a separate area for project records. So maybe if you want to jump into project records a minute, so we've got our project records area, we've got things like issues and risk registers that we've added in, but also you can see within this project records area that there is a project number that's assigned to those folders. So perhaps, Rupert, can you go into the project assets folder, which is the third one down? So what we can see by having that standard metadata that's been applied, that project number, and you could put additional things in there as well, of course, we can say anytime a document is uploaded into there, it's going to be automatically assigned that metadata. And that's all set up as part of the template when I spin up a new project.
And if you read the Microsoft documentation on Copilot, it does say that metadata forms part of that, part of your model. So that is useful to have there. We can start joining these documents together to a single ownership.
Yeah, so I think, so that's the project side. So let's come back to those support functions and we'll just break down a little bit further the idea of working in records.
Okay.
So looking at our, sorry.
Right, we're back.
So looking at our workspaces hub here, we can see again, this is for those support functions. We've got this sort of entry point to getting to our various different workspaces that we're added to, and we can see we've got sort of HR and finance, and there's a payroll one, a payroll site as well. So Go on, Rupert, you were going to say something?
So yeah, it feels a bit of overlap because I've already got a finance site. I've got an HR site. Surely one of those would own payroll, even if people from both teams are involved in it then.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it comes back to that point I was making earlier, which is, when we're designing our sites, we're not purely thinking about the department, we're thinking about the actual function that's carried out. And in some cases, there will be functions that are carried out that's split between multiple different departments. So what we're saying here is, instead of having trying to create a space within a finance site and then handling permissions, in a complicated way, we'll just spin up a separate space for payroll, and the relevant people in HR and the relevant people in finance are going to have access to it.
And actually, as a user, that would give me confidence that the security's been set up correctly, and I haven't got to go and double check that a payroll folder has been shared in the right way, or it was used for a different kind of purpose. So
exactly, it shows that a bit more thought has sort of gone into the structure. So we're going to jump into our HR site a minute.
Okay.
So again, this is looking quite similar to our projects, our project workspace that we had as well. And really just to sort of revisit this concept about having our working documents, which is the things like the trackers, maybe the draft files, the reference files, maybe little ad hoc projects that we're doing in our team, but not necessarily the filing. Whereas we then have separated out that more formal structure for employee records, which, as you can imagine, is going to be one of those, in a HR area, is going to be one of those sort of key areas that needs to be more carefully managed. And we can see within here, we're using a concept called document sets, which is a way of storing folders of documents, groups of documents, but also being able to apply, metadata such as the employee's employment status, or are there some tasks assigned to it, for instance. But then one of the key advantages as well, because this is the area, that filing area is where we really want to be introducing metadata a bit more. Because we've done that, we're able to switch over to a view where we can just see all of the individual employment contracts, for instance. So Rupert's just switched over to our employment contracts view, and what that's effectively done is hidden all of the folder structure and then just pulled out the individual documents that are tagged as contract. So instead of having to, if you're someone that needs to go and view all of the recent contracts that have been sent out, instead of having to go through every single folder to go and find them, you can just switch views and then use the metadata that you've applied to get to what you need a bit more seamlessly.
That's beautiful. Good stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, one just break thing very quickly before we move away. You'll probably notice there next to the HR title, there's a little Teams icon. And we're not going to click on that right now, but the thing that we're highlighting is, in this scenario, we need to be considering how SharePoint and Microsoft Teams work hand in hand in a scenario like this. So that's how we factored it in. If you need the benefit of the chatting and maybe, Microsoft Planner and some of those really, some of those really collaborative tools, then we can have that, but we can also apply a more formal, structured approach to how we manage our documents, but within the same context.
Got you. Okay, so that's where Teams comes in. Obviously, we talked about files being stored in the same place, as in SharePoint, but this is how we can start joining it together. Okay, so that really helps. Let's flip back to the deck and talk about the next point.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick wrap up here. As you can see, this scenario, what we're highlighting is, for a manufacturing scenario, there might be multiple value chains. So we had a projects delivery hub. In this case, you might have multiple hubs, one's for operations logistics, and then another one perhaps for product development, which might be more sort of project based. But yeah, hopefully that kind of gives you the gist.
Yeah, and that would work, I guess, for a software development company as well. So my worry is, Ben, I look at all this and I think we could be creating an awful lot of sites. Is there rules on, when to create sites, how many sites we have, too many sites?
Yeah, so there's no rules, but I think there is certainly some guidance that we would recommend. So I think, as I said, we talked about that scenario earlier with 10, thousands of teams that can be very overwhelming. So yeah, you don't want that, but there's nothing wrong with spinning up an additional site if it makes sense to do so. So some of the challenges, or some of the considerations that we put into a new site. The first is around recognizing those content scenarios. If we take HR, for instance, we don't want to try and make our HR site both be publishing information to others and also filing and collaboration, because we've got quite sensitive content in there and we'd have to start managing permissions quite carefully. So it makes sense to create a completely separate site for the publishing information of HR, such as, information about my benefits, and then keep my HR workspace for my sort of day-to-day collaboration and filing. So that's the first scenario. Another scenario is perhaps let's take that publishing, but we realize that some of the audiences to that are quite different. So maybe you've got some HR content, but you've got some UK employee benefits and you've got some USA benefits. Maybe you've got a whole different HR package depending on which country you're in. So again, it might make sense to spin up a HR USA publishing site and a HR UK, I should say, a communication site, not publishing site, to allow that sort of content to be managed and targeted to the right audience. Third scenario is where you can use sites that represent your site lifecycle, whether it's a project lifecycle, for instance. So we might have a project that starts in a tendered stage, then goes into a live project delivery stage, maybe being handed over to support. And then finally, after it reaches a certain point and any key records have been pulled out of it, it's then archived so you can benefit from the sort of maximum opportunity of space saving that things like Microsoft 365 Archive give you. And then finally, where you do need to represent slightly different groupings of permissions, such as that scenario with payroll, it makes sense to spin up a separate site for payroll instead of a complicated permission structure. But that could also apply to, for instance, if you need to create a space where you can collaborate with an external party in a secure way, then spinning up a separate site to support that makes sense as well.
Good stuff. Okay, so we've talked about building the future state. Let's think about how do we get from where I am today to this future state, the transition strategy, if you like. And there's obviously a few key parts to that. The first one being understanding what data you have, designing that future state using the principles we just talked about, and obviously part of that will be how we work, but also maybe the data you have already. Making that map between where you are and where you want to be, and ultimately then we've got to migrate, we've got to move across. So they're the key bullet points, but I've got a key question I want to ask you first, which is, if I've got my SharePoint already set up, can I fix it?
Can I fix my existing SharePoint setup? Not really, to be honest, not really. The reality here is the practicalities of trying to tidy up what you have in place are unrealistic. Being able to achieve that is unrealistic. So instead, what we're looking at is an approach where we design a nice, clean, new structure, look at what we have, and migrate or restructure the good stuff from what we have into our nice, clean, new structure. The principle is not really any different to if you're looking at migrating from a file share. So you design your structure, you look at your data in your file share, and you migrate it. It's the same concept in this case.
Okay, I think that's answered that question. So we can still use the same tenant, right? We're just going to draw a line under the past, and we're going to create our new world in the same tenant in the same SharePoint area, but we're not going to be repurposing our existing sites. It's trying to untangle something which is maybe a little bit too far gone, shall we say?
Exactly. So let's start with how we're going to approach this. So the first step is that we need to understand what we have. There's kind of 3 high-level stages and a few key talking points in each case. So the first thing is we need to catalog what we've got. So we're cataloging the sites that we have, that scenario of, thousands of teams. Generally, in our experience, that we'll find that only 20% of the sites that we have got maybe 80% of the data. Okay, it's that whole 80-20 rule that there'll be lots and lots of sites that have got barely anything in, and then we'll find that there's a small percentage of sites where most of our entire data is being stored. We also want to identify things like inactive teams, because every team is going to generate a SharePoint site as well. So we need to be finding out, are there teams that are inactive, or maybe teams that haven't got owners? anything that we can start to archive off or even delete is going to be a good thing. And then for those sites that we have identified with that sort of 80% of the data, we need to start looking at snapshotting the file usage. If this was a migration from a file share, there are tools out there such as TreeSize, for instance, that give you really good visualizations of where the data is in your structure. But SharePoint doesn't really do that out of the box. If you're just looking at a team site, you can see the folders and there's some storage metrics, but it's not anywhere near as effective. There are third-party tools that will do this, of course, but the approach that we will tend to take is to run some PowerShell scripts to effectively list out all of the files in the SharePoint site, including their file size, when they were last modified, and what their folder structure is, for instance. And then we can visualize that within a pivot table in Excel, so we can get that same kind of experience of where are the inactive areas, where are the bottlenecks, where are those large folders. So again, that 80-20% rule will probably apply within your folder structure as well. Once we've cataloged that data and we've sort of created that pivot, we then need to go through and sort of categorize it. So we're looking at how many of those sites or folders can we archive. Perhaps they were just brought over because you didn't know what to do with them. You're still not quite confident. You might need them, but you don't want to delete them yet. So we're going to mark them as archive. There's other areas that we're going to want to delete. There's documents and folders that we're going to be using as filing, because we need to keep them for that filing scenario we talked about. And then there's going to be those sort of day-to-day, working areas. The reality is, you may be thinking, oh, that's quite a big exercise to do. Have we got to do that file by file? And, again, I try and recommend a pragmatic approach here. It is unrealistic to go and categorize every file in your site. Your users are not going to do it. So the approach that we take instead is to perhaps for each area to maybe look at just the first 3 levels of the folder structure and use that as the basis for cataloging, because that is generally going to be good enough to help you get some insight in what you need to move over or not. So once we've done that, we're then mapping to our future state. So as we can say, maybe with the archive data, we might want to move it to a separate site that Copilot has been excluded from accessing through search, for instance. We might want some metadata in there, maybe not, we're not too worried. The stuff we're going to delete, we'll just leave it where it is. We don't need to bring it over. The filing and records area, yes, we'll want to bring it into our filing library. That's the area that we're going to want to pay a bit more attention to and start looking at doing some, metadata tagging where feasible for sort of key areas. And then with the working docs, we can move that into our working documents of collaboration space. We're not worried about applying metadata to that. We can take more of a lift and shift approach in that case.
Yeah, and I think interesting on the final metadata points is we're seeing some interest now with AI being able to help with that metadata by having a look at that document, analyzing it, and giving you a head start, so it's not a manual process. Ben, do you want to give us an example of what that report looks like when you go and do your analysis?
Yeah, so this is a sort of anonymized report, but just to give you a flavor of this, of what we're looking at is, so as we can see in this particular case, what we've done here is run that snapshot, and we've created a pivot table. Obviously, it's the key things have been blurred out, but what that is giving us is a breakdown per site. You can see how many items there are in that site. You can see how much data. So that third site we've got expanded there. It's got 57 gigabytes of data in it. It was last modified, a few days ago. And then we can start looking at that folder structure within it. So again, I can see that there's a few folders that have got a few files, and then there's this one folder that's got nearly 18,000 files in it that is really, really active. So again, we're starting to narrow down and see, again, if we look at that, we've got a subfolder there that's got a couple of things, and then we've got 2 that have got thousands of files in it. So this is helping us start to identify at a lower level where are the bottlenecks, where's all of that actual volume being taken up with, because it's not that easy to see it in the SharePoint user interface.
Yeah, I think it's really handy. You can see there that these content review docs hasn't been accessed this last year. So, that's obviously an interesting candidate and one to ask more questions about somebody who knows more about the content. But I'm not having to go to a file level. I'm only drilling 3 levels down and I've got the information I need.
Yeah, particularly as you say, when it's an area that hasn't been accessed, but it's got a lot of data in it. So yeah, what are we doing with it? Yeah.
So let's move on to the approach, Ben, of right, okay, I've designed my target structure. We've gone through the exercise. We've identified publishing, collaboration, filing, how we work as a business, and we're then going to do that mapping piece, which you just started talking about there. So you've got the underlying data. We then need to map that data to the target. Now, the key part is we're looking to train people. Now, people have been using SharePoint in different ways, but there's a key thing is we're changing the way they're going to be saving information in terms of this is how your business process now looks. But there might also be some technical training in terms of this is how you do version control because you've been using suffixes all the time. You don't need to do that in scenarios. So there might be that point. Obviously, the migration itself, now we'll talk about approaches to that on the next slide. But typically looking to do this over a weekend, so we're not causing any disruption. You've had your training on the Friday, you go in for a weekend, you come back on Monday, the new world is good to go. Key part of that, which we do for every project, is reconciliation, because any approach is not perfect, and having that validation that we've checked everything in the source, we've checked everything in the target, it's all matching, we're in a good place. And of course, that support is, when someone, maybe often we see this is, oh, I forgot how I mapped that, where's this gone? You can have that quick conversation, you can point to that reference sheet. And as you can see at the bottom there, we say repeat per wave because you want to think about how many people do you want impact at once with this approach. And so we look at waves in terms of number of people impacted, amount of data, and try and group people logically together to help make that come to life. Now, Ben, in terms of moving that data, what's the best way to do it? Can we drag and drop?
Yeah, so I mean, we sort of highlighted three ways. The reality is there's only one way that we'd recommend, but if we just talk through each of them. So the first is allowing the end users to move the data into the structure themselves. The reality is this is never going to happen. It is going to just go on and on forever. And as we can see, you'll have one leg straddled in the old way of working and then the other straddled in the new way of working, and it's just not going to be effective at all. The next way is to get the admin to approach this like a sort of migration, it's been done over a weekend, using the native out of the box move files option that SharePoint gives you. The problem with this is that it is painfully slow because what it is doing is migrating or moving, I should say, all of the version history. And actually, if you really want to know how it does it, it will rebuild in the new area and it will delete in the old area. And it's just a bit unreliable. It doesn't work at scale, and you are going to be spending a long time doing it. I did this once at the very beginning of my career, and I've never done it again.
That's all we need to know.
Yeah, so the only realistic way of doing this is to use a third-party tool. Microsoft don't have the native tool to do this themselves. There's a very useful SharePoint migration tool, but that is for file shares or on-premise SharePoint environments. It's not for working within the same tenant. So realistically, the tool that you're most likely to have heard of potentially is ShareGate. That is the sort of standard tool out there to do this. We also use a tool called Migrate DMS, which is very powerful and can do a similar thing and more. Realistically, all of these tools, there are other tools out there as well, all of these tools will come at a cost. So you'll have to factor that into your project budget. ShareGate you can license for a year. So if you're going to be doing this over multiple waves and you want to build up that sort of, expertise internally, it is a good tool, plus also comes with some ongoing governance features as well.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. The Microsoft migration tool is very much designed to get you onto the environment. Once you're in there, then they're happy, aren't they? So they don't need to write a tool for that.
Exactly.
Let's put this onto a plan, Ben. So now we've agreed that we need to use a tool. We need to set up a start from new. We can't kind of fix what we've got. It's not realistic, is it? So yeah, have you got what a plan might look like and how you might approach such a project?
Yeah, so we put an example project plan that that sort of describes how we would approach this. I'm not going to go through this line by line, but just to give you a bit of a flavor, I think the first thing is that before we get into our migration waves, we have this sort of enablement wave. And that's about doing that hub site architecture, defining the templates that you need, getting everything ready, you know, all of the user guides that you're going to be preparing when you do your training, you know, running through your pilots, making sure you're all sort of good to go. And once you've carried that out, you're going to move into your migration waves themselves. And in this case, this is just one migration wave. But as Rupert said, you know, you might carry this over multiple. I've got one customer that's planning running this over 5 migration waves because they've got a large volume of data to manage. But the key thing within this really is when we start looking at that sort of bottom swim lane there, where we're looking at the site and file mapping support. And as you can see, we have deliberately timed this so that the training is happening no more than 3 weeks before that migration window. So particularly for end user training, we would do that within the 2-week period. You'd have the champion training starting a bit before that, because those champions would then, you know, provide ongoing help to the end users as well. We do that over the weekend migration. That migrate files, you know, point is about preparing, get everything ready over the weekend migration, and then you're into post-migration support. So providing that support to your champions so they can then pass that on to their end users for a period of weeks afterwards. And then you repeat that multiple times. My general recommendation is not to try and, you know, maybe finish one wave before you start the next wave. I would say it can be a bit much otherwise, but yeah.
I think particularly at the beginning when you're finding your feet for wave 1 and 2.
Right.
Really interesting, Ben. So look, we're coming towards the end. If any of this was interesting to you and you want to have a conversation, do go onto the website informationexp.com and you can book into my diary, and we can have a further conversation about what you're up against. So to summarize what we've seen in today's session is we talked first about how to identify and diagnose. We talked about 5 examples where we saw that you might be struggling with SharePoint. The classic example is you basically lost confidence in the solution. You can't find things easily without speaking to the expert. And ultimately, that health check says, when you can say yes to these 3 things, then you're looking in a good place. We then dived into the principles about, well, how do I design my future state? And we've got some of the webinars on both hubs and also the structure of sites. So you might find those useful. You thought that was a particularly interesting part of the session. And obviously, the key bit then, which brings this together, is the transition. So understanding your data, the fact that you will have to start from again, but you're going to start with a blank slate, and everything's going to be consistent. And then understanding that data, what you're going to bring, what you're going to archive, and this is going to set you up for Copilot as well, because then you can start creating agents which work on that trusted information. Education is a key part. This is not just a technical project. We're going to involve people, both in understanding their data, but also helping them understand how to work in the new world, and of course, finish off with that migration and reconciliation. Again, Ben, you see a lot of these projects, so thank you for sharing your expertise today. And thank you everyone else for joining us. Hope you found it was useful. And yep, as I said before, if you like a conversation, do drop something in my diary. You can find the link on informationexp.com. Thanks again, Ben.
Thanks a lot.